Hi. I apologize, first of all, for not being able to do this in Spanish. If I'm invited back next year, I will make every effort to do that. So I'll become fluent in about a year. The subject of this lecture today, and sorry while I deal with some technical difficulties, thank you very much. The subject today is reporting tech trends in the US. And I wanted to start off with a Borges quote, one, because I'm in Argentina, and two, because I feel like the idea that one shouldn't talk unless one can improve on silence is a good one to remember for everyone, but specifically for journalists. There's a lot of, forgive my expression, bullshit out there in the tech community, and that bullshit can be overwhelming at times. Our project, I think, as tech journalists is in one sense very simple. It's easier than some of our colleagues who have to go off and dodge bullets and fight wars and deal with politicians who are terrible. But at the same time, we all are addressing sort of certain very simple sort of fundamental truths, one of which is that journalism is the art of asking smart questions in a simple way, or difficult questions in a simple way, to get at truths that we have an opportunity to express for our readership, right? And our project, such as it is, whether it's reporting tech trends in the US or reporting politics or whatever it may be, is to be that voice for the people who can't sit in that room and ask those questions. And those questions can be very fundamental. And they matter no matter where you are in the world of journalism. So when I started reporting, I was working for a newsletter service in New York City. It was on the 4th floor of a very, very hip office building in Soho. And I had just graduated from college, and man, it was the coolest thing I had ever seen in my life. There were new, like, iMac computers everywhere, and this was in 1999 when the iMac had first come out. So it was those big, beautiful, round, bubbly ones. And I had never seen anything like it in my life. I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I went to school in the Midwest, and I had come to New York to write the great American novel. And I wound up in reporting, so there you go. But I bring up that anecdote for one reason. I started off writing for one kind of audience, to be in a room for them and ask one kind of question, which was to promote or clarify for entrepreneurs, for startup investors, and for the community that's involved in starting tech companies, what it meant to start a tech company, what questions you needed to, what questions the entrepreneur might want to know. How do I start this business? How do I pitch to an investor? What sorts of things are investors looking for? What makes a compelling business? These were the questions that I was addressing for my readership at that time. And I think it's important to foreground what it is that your readership wants when you think about the story that you're writing. So I work for TechCrunch, and our job, as I see it at least, is to work for the entrepreneur and the community at large to inform everyone about what it means to be working in tech these days. And I'll get to tech trends in just one second, but I really wanted to start there. So you have to know your audience, and the TechCrunch audience is similar but different from the Wall Street Journal audience, from the New York Times audience, from the Financial Times audience, from the audience that reads Wired, although that's a much closer connection, I think, than with some of these other publications. And I wanted to start there because I feel like that's important. How many people in the room work for General Press, a general publication? Okay. How many people are tech specific? Okay. How many people just think it's cool to be here? That's me. Fucking awesome. Sorry, pardon my language. Okay, so now I'll get into the meat of this talk. Forgive me, this is also my first time speaking instead of interviewing, so I might not be the best at it. The pace of technological change. I wanted to start with an essay that Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of the UK, wrote in 1932 for popular mechanics, which was, at the time, the Wired of its day. It had been around for, it's been around for over a century. At this point, I think, going very strong still. And it was one of the original publications focused on technology. I think initially the Model T, but now we're looking at a world that's much changed. I bring this up because Winston, in his essay, wrote about a lot of the things that we're confronting now as technology journalists and sort of by extension as a society, including genetic modification of humans, including lab-grown meat, including harnessing nuclear power, including other alternative forms of energy that could be used for the betterment, ostensibly, of mankind. So what we're addressing now is not new. What's new is how fast it's grown. So technology has become a force that not only enables human advancement, but has come to dominate most aspects of human society. I feel like a lot of you are on your phones right now. There you go. If you use Facebook, if you're on Twitter, if you are on Snapchat, if you search for anything on the web, you use Google, and that's pretty much everything. So these massive, massive companies have come to control everything from search and advertising to the way we interact socially, to how we communicate with each other socially by the phone, to how we shop and buy, to what we play and what we watch, and to even the sort of fundamental layer of how all of this stuff gets done. It's all done through technology. There is no point in which your life or your readers' lives isn't impacted in some way by a tech company, many of them in the United States, which is another problem. We'll get there. So, 5 of the 10 most valuable companies in the US are tech companies. Apple is worth around $850 billion. Alphabet is worth around $649 billion. Microsoft is worth around, you can read the chart. That's a shit ton of money. I think that's the technical term, a shit ton of money. And that sort of dominance by one sector of the economy, by one industry, is fairly unique in US history and I think in human history, where you have so many companies producing so much wealth concentrated in one particular sector. And that speaks to our responsibility, I think, collectively as journalists, which is to understand the ramifications of all of this, what it means that there's so much power and so much wealth concentrated in the hands of so few companies. If you think about it, Alphabet has become the way in which most people de facto look for things and search for knowledge. That is an incredible amount of power, and we'll get to how Alphabet and Google can abuse it and have abused it recently, potentially, so people are asserting, and what that may mean. So in the US, you've got these powerful companies, and you've also got some of their misbehaviors. They're corporate enterprises. They are out for the benefit of their shareholders and for society by extension, hopefully, their customers. But in some cases, that can fall apart. And those issues come around labor rights, product innovation cycles, cybersecurity, political influence, the monopolistic tendencies of these companies, or monopolistic, potentially monopolistic power, I should say, of these companies is something that the US tech press is, I think, beginning to struggle with now. And these are things that are not academic. When I started writing about technology in 99, 2000, mostly these were one part of a sort of universe of either distractions or tools that people would use to improve their lives. Software to make your work better. Email was faster than letters or faxes or teletype or whatever. But now these things are so imbricated in society that it's hard to find an area that they're not touching. Now I wanted to contrast that a little bit with what's happening in China, where there is this move toward a more dominant role for technology in the Chinese society, which is on the one hand, sort of, there's a counterweight, which is the Chinese government, which still controls most of the Chinese economy. So state-owned enterprises in China have a huge amount of power, and the government in China operates with much more freedom, ironically, than the government in the States. So they have more control over what these companies can do and will do. In fact, the collaborative nature of the corporate entities in China with the government is one of the things that's allowed them to flourish. And China just, in general, doesn't have a problem with monopolies. So you'll see Alibaba come to dominate various aspects of China's online economy in a way that you wouldn't have happen in the States. You'd have it be much more fragmented and fractured. But the consolidation of control around these companies online is pretty intense and also celebrated with, I think, to the same degree, actually, that it's looked at in the US with some measure of concern and alarm. So what's next? That's a SpaceX rocket taking off. The next 15 years instead of the next 50, because as Winston Churchill mentions in his essay, these cycles of technology advancement are compressing. So things are happening much more rapidly than they had in the past. And we are actually getting to some of the things that Churchill postulated would happen in 1982. He was off by, you know, a couple decades, but still in the ballpark. So we're looking at automation and artificial intelligence. We're looking at CRISPR, which is genetic sequencing and sort of genetic programming, and other life sciences technologies. You've got augmented reality and virtual reality. You've got the blockchain. You've got energy and materials, new energy sources and new materials, space, and agriculture technology and food technology. These are sort of the emerging areas where startups in the States, tech-focused startups in the States, tend to be spending a lot of time these days with various flavors. And again, it's helpful to recognize that with all of this, there's a lot of bullshit. So one of your jobs, one of our jobs as reporters, is to cut through that noise and get at the heart of the story. Now, I want to use a couple of examples to sort of illustrate what I mean by that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these. We don't have a ton of time, but I wanted to get through at least some of them. So if you look at all of these different areas through the lens of Uber, Theranos, Magic Leap, blockchain technologies as a whole, Elon Musk as an individual, as an entity, and as sort of a symbol of what's right and wrong, with a lot of the hagiography or sort of celebration of the entrepreneur to the detriment, I think, of some reporting. And finally, to the investment industry that supports all this stuff itself and what's happening there. So there's Travis. He was speaking on stage at our conference in 2000, I think that's 2012. The trouble with Uber, where to start with the trouble with Uber? I mean, I think one unique issue that Uber faces is simply, from a business perspective, its valuation and how it's been funded. It is far and away the most expensive and most highly valued tech startup in the past decade, I think. That's still a private company. And there are lots of reasons for that, and they have to do with sort of macroeconomic trends that maybe we can talk about later. But that, I think, has been part of the problem that Uber has faced, in that it hasn't had to become a public company and be answerable to shareholders, which in some ways has given it time for the problems that were inherent in the organization to fester in a way that it would not have done were it subject to public scrutiny. That's one opinion. And at this point, I will mention that all of the dumbass things I say are my opinions, and anything that I say that's smart is totally on TechCrunch. That's all them. So that's the way that works. I am beholden to my corporate overlord. So there was the valuation and financing issue, which allowed some of these problems that were inherent in the company to fester, to sort of grow in a pretty cancerous way. One of those problems was sexual harassment and the general workplace dynamics at the company, which were exposed earlier this year in a blog post by a very courageous woman named Susan Fowler, who talked about at length and with great detail all of the issues that she had faced as a woman working at Uber. I laugh, but it's not funny. It's pretty tragic. You add to that, and again, I think some of this can be laid at the feet of not having to be beholden to outside observers. Allegations of intellectual property theft from Waymo with Uber's self-driving car program. And those are sort of the internal corporate issues that I think Uber faces. There are others, because Jesus Christ, there's not an issue that Uber doesn't face right now, it seems. But for our readership, our collective readership, the public, I think the last two are sort of among the more interesting ones, which are the ways in which Uber's expressed goal of automating a large facet of movement and logistics and transportation will disrupt and affect jobs and the economy. And I'm going to return to this theme over and over again. What is the real life human impact of all of the companies that we cover? Because I think that is the crux of the story. It's what the benefit is that these companies can, what the benefit these companies can provide to society could be, and also where they could prevent, where they could cause problems in society. So automation is going to consume whole industries, and the ramifications of that are something that we as a community need to address and raise and work through with these companies, or at least force them to confront. The insurance industry is going to go away with self-driving cars, or a large portion of it. Truckers, long-haul truckers, which is a huge component of the US labor pool, are going to go away once long-haul trucks become autonomous. And Uber is, I think, just a focal point for this broader discussion around automation and robotics and what that means for human industry as a whole. And you're starting to see technologists, investors, and others wrestle with this in various ways. I think Peter Thiel will tell you that the best solution is to buy land in New Zealand and wait for the apocalypse to come down there, which he's done, by the way. So, you know, you can join the billionaires in New Zealand and wait out the end of the world, or you can try and address it and do something about it, which brings me to the intersection of startups and government. Increasingly, as technology companies become more imbricated in the fabric of society, they become, or woven into the fabric of society, there are more touch points between legislation, regulation, government, and these companies and their operations. Now, Uber went about this, I think, in a particularly terrible way, by sort of running ripshod over legislative policy, entering a market, doing whatever the hell they wanted, and waiting for government to come in and tell them not to. It is an extension of the Silicon Valley philosophy of move fast and break things, which works until everything is broken. And so I think that's something as well that we as a community need to keep in mind, that there are a lot of ideas and ideals that entrepreneurs and investors may privilege that could not necessarily be as beneficial to society at large. Oh, who's that guy? Oh, hey, that's me. That's me and Elizabeth Holmes, the chief executive officer of Theranos, back before Theranos was exposed as a fraud. So Theranos is a company that raised $500 million in venture capital from investors, and has a few specific lessons, I think, for reporters, myself included. One of them is that life sciences reporting is really goddamn hard. It is in many ways more technical and much more challenging for a more general reporter to address. And you saw that, I think, in a lot of the stories that came out about Theranos, where claims were made, but not necessarily. there wasn't a follow-up question around verification. And that gets back to my point of journalists having to ask sort of inelegant or artless questions, which is, I don't really freaking understand what the hell this is. Why is it doing what you say it's doing, and how does it work? And there are some basic questions that might be rude to ask, but that one has to ask of these people, because otherwise you wind up with something where people are getting false diagnoses of blood issues or diseases, which is terrible and terrifying. Theranos was able to get as far as it did because it raised a significant amount of capital. And there's a tendency, I think, among the general financial press and the tech press to become overawed with a lot of money getting thrown at something. Money does not mean validation. Money just means money. And there are lots of ways to raise money. Whoops, oh my God. There we go. Wait, oh no. Go back. Nope, all right. Sorry, we've got a lot to go through. There we go. So that, I mean, those are some of the issues to think about with Theranos. I want to be cognizant of time. Let's see. The proof is in the pudding. Ultimately, what did Theranos in was someone going and getting their blood done and being like, this doesn't actually work. This is ridiculous. An excellent reporter from the Wall Street Journal. And that, I think, is indicative of the kinds of things that one can do as a reporter to actually prove things out. If someone is going to make claims, see if you can verify them. Always see if you can verify them, because otherwise you're just writing advertising copy. No one wants to do that. And the responsibility of the readers in Theranos' case is not academic, it's not philosophical, it's very real. These were people who could have been misdiagnosed with potentially life-threatening issues because this company was lying about its technology. And that is extremely problematic. All right, Magic Leap, HoloLens and Oculus. AR and VR are some of the coolest sort of visual and entertainment-oriented things that are happening in the tech world right now. With Magic Leap, you also run into this problem of big financing equating to validation in a lot of cases, which isn't necessarily true. Now, what you've seen is that technology is advancing faster than some companies can keep up with, and so Magic Leap's initial claims, while exceptional, have been overtaken in some ways by the market and by what Google is doing and what Apple is doing, and some of these other startup companies as well, actually. Facebook has bet big on VR with its acquisition of Oculus, but it also has an AR play in the market. Now I'm just sort of blowing through these things, I'm sorry, as general trends. Bitcoin, we'll get to Bitcoin. There's a lot of opportunity in Bitcoin, but like Flavor Flav says, don't believe the hype. Because there is a lot of hype in Bitcoin, and when you have any market that's expanded so rapidly and created so much wealth, look for the frost and the death of all the tulips. Every bubble can burst, but there, I think, are actual real applications for the blockchain that will surface with some of these projects, and things will, I think, pan out. It's just very early. So again, trying to cut through the noise and not just take every announcement or every ICO coin offering or every launch of a new startup fundraising in the Bitcoin space or blockchain space as gospel. Everybody's trying to make a buck. Alon is a really cool guy with a lot of interesting things to say, but he's not infallible. No entrepreneur is, and I think this gets to another issue that I see with journalists occasionally, and I myself fall prey to it every once in a while, which is the celebration of the entrepreneur and the genius of the entrepreneur as something that can't be questioned or criticized. And part of the role that we play, again, is to sort of pop these bubbles wherever they might appear, including with entrepreneurs and investors who sometimes think they are masters of the universe and can shape and reshape the world and don't really think about the consequences or care about them. And one of our jobs is, I think, to remind these folks, because we're in the room with them, that there are, in fact, consequences, and that these things matter. And some of them can be amazing bets. Tesla is an incredible story, an incredible story. He ran that company into the wall, almost bankrupted himself personally. It was almost the death of a couple of venture funds, and then it came back and is doing amazingly well. And it's not just an electric vehicle story or an automated vehicle story, it's also an energy story. It's a material science story with its battery and solar power business. And then Elon, because he is Elon, is also in space. And that too is incredible, and another example of the ways in which the boundaries of what was imagined possible by someone like Winston Churchill in 1932 are becoming real in 2017. Finally, there's the Boring Company, which I think is a dumbass idea. And that's what I mean by not everything that anyone does is perfect. The Boring Company's plan is to build these, how many are you familiar with this, the Boring Company? Okay, so the Boring Company is anything but boring, but it's a dumb idea. He's building massive sort of earth movers that will dig huge holes in the ground to create new tunnels. Now that's in itself not a problem. There need to be more subway systems and tunnel systems in the world, and if he just stopped at building these machines because there's a finite number of them, and you could make a great business selling these things, that'd be great. But no, Elon wants to like reshape the entire infrastructure of Los Angeles by having these massive tunnels move platforms of cars and bicycles and trucks at 100 miles an hour underneath the city of Los Angeles. There are already things that move people through tunnels. They're called trains, and they work really well. And I wish someone would just let him know that that's a thing in the world. So, I mean, this is my opinion, and opinions are worthless. But I think that it's something to keep in mind. Finally, there's Dave McClure and the venture capital industry. And Dave McClure has become sort of a poster boy for some of the things that are wrong with VC right now, at least in the States. I don't know if y'all are aware, but the entire tech industry, including the investors who are responsible for financing a large portion of these companies, have been racist jerks, have been selfish jerks, sexist jerks, and have been kind of elitist jerks. Recently it's come to light. And so one of the things that the venture industry needs to work on is how not to be racist, sexist, or elitist jerks, which is tougher than it sounds. Beyond that, there are challenges coming to venture capital from coin offerings, from fundraising through crowdfunding sources, at least in the States. And there are other mechanisms to raise money that entrepreneurs have access to that are worth writing about as, again, our sort of responsibility to our readership. Those among them that want to start businesses should know that venture capital is not the only option out there. Oftentimes it is the best option out there because these guys are experienced and they do have a lot of value and wisdom to share. And I don't want to say that that's not the case, but it's worth knowing for entrepreneurs that there are other ways to build a business where they don't have to give up so much of a stake. And that, I think, is worth noting and worth sharing with them. Now, what they don't get is the experience of people who have been through it before, who have raised businesses, who have networks, who have access that they otherwise might not have. And that's important to keep in mind as well. So I wouldn't say that the venture industry is out or that there's no point for professional investors or reason to get them. But I will say that there are increasing challenges to that notion that one has to go through a VC. Increased international markets, again, China becomes relevant here because large Chinese companies and Chinese investment firms are moving abroad to start to spend some of the capital that they have in other places, including the US, including Argentina, including Australia, all over the world. You're seeing China start to compete more aggressively, and they're not the only ones. The other thing that's happening with venture capital is that it needs to look beyond Silicon Valley. For too long, I think the industry has focused on the Sand Hill Road corridor and trying to force companies to operate within that universe as satellites around sort of Silicon Valley's sun. And that is no longer the case. For a number of reasons, people are trying to move out beyond the Silicon Valley network. And I think that presents opportunities for places, including Buenos Aires and Argentina and Latin America as a whole, for entrepreneurs to access capital, to look at money that might come from outside so that they can raise those regional and global businesses that will compete eventually with companies like Google, with companies like Facebook, to become the next new thing in the tech community. And with that, I think I've overstayed my welcome, and I think that's all I've got. So I thank you very, very, very much for the time, and look forward to answering all of y'all's questions. Thank you.